So when during a non-comment period, you'll just hit the stop video button. And when it's time for comment, you just start video. So you're just toggling your video on and off to show the timer.
Thank you.
No problem.
Great. So I'm going to jump in because it's just about 6 o'clock. And do I need to make any disclosures before when we start the meeting? Are we ready to start?
Okay, it's starting.
Okay.
Public comment is 2 minutes or 3 minutes?
3 minutes unless we have a ton of people.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Good evening, everybody. Noting that it is right at 6 o'clock, so we will get started. Thank you very much to the tech crew who makes all of this possible. Acknowledge that we are down one of our council members, and so hopefully she will join us soon. Has anybody heard from her? Not seeing it.
No, I have not.
I'll go ahead and try to track her down while you guys continue.
Thank you. So good evening, everybody. And we're having our virtual homelessness-housing task force of the city of Hayward. And we do have translation available. Yolanda, would you tell us about that, please?
Hi, good evening. Tonight we are offering Spanish interpretation service. If you are joining the meeting using the Zoom application, you'll be able to select either English or Spanish. The interpretation is now live. Panelists now need to select English on their Zoom toolbar from the interpretation button. When selecting Spanish, it is recommended to select mute original audio to listen to the meeting in Spanish. Our interpreter will now make the announcement in Spanish. Thank you.
Gracias, Laura. Any other announcements? Okay. So this evening we will have our roll call, then our public comments on things that are not on the agenda, and then our minutes, staff report on our agenda items, public comments, and then comments from my colleagues. So then we'll go ahead with roll call. Yolanda?
Good evening. Councilmember Salinas.
Here.
Councilmember Lamnin.
Present.
I see that Councilmember Wahab is not here. Councilmember Wahab, not present. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Salinas, any comments on the minutes?
I don't.
Okay. Do you want to move those?
I move the minutes.
Thank you. And I will second those. And since we are it, I will consider that approved unless somebody needs a roll call for legal reasons. Hearing none, we will keep moving.
And,
so,
Councilmember
yes.
Lemon, I just want to let you know that
Thank you.
Councilmember Wahab, she acknowledged, she just said she's going to be joining in just a minute.
Okay. Thank you for that. So we'll move on to our main action item of the evening. Oh, I'm sorry. I completely skipped public comments. So are there public comments? I do see we have a hand. I apologize for that. So this is for items not on the agenda, not the trust fund item. We'll do a separate public comment for that. So Yolanda, it looks like Dolores Tejada has a question or a comment.
Shall I make the announcement about the public comments? Okay. If you
Absolutely.
wish,
Thank you.
okay. If you wish to speak and you're using the Zoom application, please click the raise hand button. If you're dialing in, press *9 to raise your hand on the phone and use *6 to unmute yourself. If you are streaming the meeting through Zoom on your computer, but dialing in via phone, please mute yourself so that there's no feedback sound during the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. And Are you managing the speakers, Yolanda? You are muted, Yolanda.
I don't see anybody raising their hand.
I'm seeing Dolores Tejada. Oh, all right. Went down.
Okay,
Okay.
got it. Okay.
Hi, I had my hand raised for item 2.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Okay. Then we will move on to item 2. And is that Jennifer? Is that you or Christina?
That would be me. Good evening,
Excellent.
everyone. Let me give me just a moment to get myself set up. The item before us tonight is funding priorities for the Inclusionary Housing Trust Fund. Let me get myself regrouped, excuse me. Wanted to greet everyone. Thank you for coming and participating in the meeting and this discussion tonight, and to our task force members for their feedback. So we're looking for comments on our funding priorities for the Inclusionary Housing Trust Fund. Wanted to give you an overview of our discussion. We will be doing an in-depth look. The background is actually going to be a majority of the presentation. We wanted to give you a lot of background information to help inform the decision. And the primary areas of focus for the comments would be identifying the project types that we want to fund, and also identifying the process for allocating these funds. If the task force recommends going forward with a notice of funding availability, we've also identified what some of those major changes would be. And to synthesize that all, we've come up with a summary of our recommendations, because we have recommendations in both of the 2 categories, and we would conclude with what the next steps would be. Sorry, all my controls just got covered by all of the people. There we go. And so the background, as I mentioned before, we have a lot of topics to cover in the background. First, just to acknowledge that this item supports the strategic roadmap. Information about our Inclusionary Housing Trust Fund, including eligible uses of the funds, the amount of funding we have available, what the current affordable housing pipeline looks like, projects we've funded, projects we haven't, also what our status is in terms of compliance with our regional housing needs, and what the housing needs for Hayward residents look like. So who is it that needs support in the community in terms of housing? And so this supports the strategic priority of preserve, protect, and produce housing. And specifically, we were tasked with holding a work session to establish our funding priorities for the trust fund and to explore the potential areas that we could, potential types of housing that we could support, such as rental, ownership, cooperative housing, or shelter opportunities. So throughout this report, we touch on those different subjects. Since the purpose of this discussion is to identify areas that we can identify our priorities for expending Inclusionary Housing Trust Fund, I wanted to provide a background on the trust fund, how it was established, how it's funded, and what its eligible uses are. So this is a component of the Affordable Housing Ordinance. It was established under that ordinance, and it is the ordinance mitigates the impact of the development of market rate housing on the need for affordable housing. So as market rate housing gets developed, it increases the need to produce more affordable housing. So developers have options and ways they can comply, either by including on-site affordable housing or payment of an affordable housing in lieu fees. There's several other options, but those are the 2 main ones. And this payment of the fee then is deposited into the Inclusionary Housing Trust Fund. The intended uses of the funds is to increase the supply of affordable housing. It also allows for using 10% of the funds for administration. And there are specific project types that are identified in the Affordable Housing Ordinance that the funds could be spent on, which includes new construction, which can be either ownership or rental, acquisition of affordability covenants and substantial rehabilitation of properties, and also residential facilities such as shelters, but that would be subject to special findings just to confirm that it mitigates that impact of the development of market rate housing on the need for affordable housing. The staff report that we prepared includes a detailed accounting of all of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, but for the purpose of this discussion, we're providing high-level summary information. To date, since the inception of the fee in 2011, we have collected over $9.7 million in the Inclusionary Housing Trust Fund. However, in 2018, we committed $4.8 million to 3 projects in order to fund the development of 259 units. We currently have $4.4 million in uncommitted funds, and we have invoiced about $1.6 million to projects that are in the pipeline. So those projects would be projects that have been improved in their entitlement application, but they still haven't pulled their permits. The trigger for payment of the fee is either prior to pulling your permits or prior to receiving your certificate of occupancy. So we'll see projects come in that may take a lot of time between the time they get approved and the time they actually pull their permits. So, but we know we have at least $1.6 million in pending invoices. We also had staff compile a list of what the affordable housing pipeline looks like, giving you a little high-level information about what it looks like in terms of the development of affordable housing. We have 9 projects that we have identified, which includes 4 city projects. And I have a list on the next slide that shows you a little more information about which projects those are and what the needs of those projects are. We also have 6 new projects that have no city funding and no assistance at this point, but have identified that they need additional funding or support to be feasible. In total, we're looking at the increase of 649 units of affordable housing, including rental housing, shelters, and ownership. It would be serving a variety of community members, seniors, families, people who are currently unhoused, people who are low income. And we've identified a funding gap for all these projects in total. It looks that they would need about $43.1 million in order for these projects to be developed. When we separate that between existing projects, so these may be projects that the city has land development agreements with or that we previously funded, there's a funding gap between $4.2 million and $6.2 million. When we're looking at these new projects, their funding gap is about just about $37 million. So we see this substantial need for financial support to increase the supply of affordable housing. And provided here just to give you, to identify which projects are current city projects. We have one project that is very new and has not gone through the entitlement process, but could potentially produce 99 units of affordable housing, a Habitat for Humanity ownership project, and 2 rental housing projects, which would be targeting families and seniors. So we have about 242 units that need additional funding, somewhere in the range of $4 million and $6.2 million. And I also want to discuss this in terms of complying with the regional housing needs allocation. The chart before you shows what our compliance goal is based on what we've reported to date, what our compliance rate is. But then we want to anticipate what our estimated compliance is when we look at how many units we've approved so far, what's pending in terms of being approved, and where we think we might be at the end of the compliance period. So when we're looking at estimated compliance, we're doing better in the low income category, with potential 72% compliance rate. We make some progress in the very low with a 39% compliance rate, but is also low. And in the moderate income category, it seems to be the hardest target population to provide housing for at a 15% compliance. When we look at our affordable housing pipeline and the projects that we identify, some of the decisions you will make will have bearing on how we can comply with our RHNA numbers. So for example, if some of our city-funded, currently funded projects don't move forward, the ones that have been entitled or are included in this approved list, we would lose 143 units of affordable housing in compliance. If we approve the project that is very new and hasn't been approved yet, then we increase the number of affordable units by 99. And if we're able to move any of the new projects forward, we have this potential of increasing our compliance by 407 units. So we can see this relationship between the pipeline and what we could potentially do in terms of improving our compliance with our RHNA numbers. We also took a look at what our Hayward housing need was. So when we looked at our RHNA compliance, we have these goals that were established by the state that include moderate income, but we wanted to look at the Hayward population and see where is the greatest need in terms of supporting housing. And so we hired HRNA to conduct a displacement study for us. And some of the major findings include that there's a significant housing supply gap. You'll see in this graphic that there's the demand in these lower price points is very high, where we have a funding gap for this, let's say the $1,250 rent price point. We can see that there's a gap in terms of supply of 4,460 units. So that shows us kind of that struggle where people are paying more for housing than what they would in terms of if the housing were available at a lower cost to them and be more affordable. And so it's really a significant impact on the lower income ranges, as you see here in this graphic. We've also noticed that rents and homelessness are increasing, and Black and Hispanic renting households experience a greater displacement pressure and cost burden. We also see that there's this significant loss of naturally occurring affordable housing, which I'll show in the next slide. But I want you to pay attention kind of to where those supply gaps are, and then how it relates to the decrease in available naturally occurring affordable housing. So on this next slide, you'll see kind of in that price point range of 500 to 875 and 875 to 1,250, we see this loss from 2010 to 2019 at units being affordable at these price points, which shows us, well, while the rents changed, the need for those lower rents did not. We also wanted to provide information on affordability of home ownership, and it was determined that it's inaccessible to most low-income renters. So we'll see this graph here. We can see that the median sales price at $684,000 is really only accessible to people earning about $150,000 a year. So what that means in terms of Hayward renters is we have only about 6% of Hayward renters could afford the median sales price. We also took a look about what that means for trying to purchase a moderate income resale restricted unit. And only about 35% of Hayward residents would be able to afford that moderately priced income or moderately priced affordable ownership unit.
Christina, just renters. You just said Hayward residents, Hayward renters.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Hayward renters. Yeah, so we were trying to make, because I think that distinction that homeowners maybe have that ability to purchase some of these median sales price, but trying to transition somebody from being a renter to a homeowner is challenging when the demographic of the renters has lower overall income than the city as a whole. So our homeowners in Hayward have a higher income and have more capacity to buy an additional property. So the demonstrated need for housing is at a lower price point that and would require a larger city subsidy. The buyer would also have to have the credit capacity to be able to buy, and they would have to have income sufficient to sustain the ownership. So we're looking at being able to make major repairs to not only being able to afford your mortgage, but being able to address those major repairs as the property ages. We also looked at this from a racial equity lens and determined that Black and Hispanic households experience a greater cost burden compared to white and Asian households. Black and Hispanic renters also represent a disproportionate share of cost burden renters. And Black residents are overrepresented among the city's homeless population. And in terms of cost burden, just as a point of reference, Black householders make up 18% of Hayward residents, but 22% of all cost burden renters. Sorry, I keep doing that, residents. Let me say that again. Black households make up 18% of Hayward renters, but 22% of all cost burden renters. And for Hispanic households, they make up 41% of the cost burden or of renters, but almost half of all the cost burden renters. So there's this disproportionate impact on Black and Hispanic Hayward renters. And so looking at this, kind of taking a step back and looking at what it means, is that the economic pressure really has intensified over the last 10 years. And has already resulted in the loss of low-income Hayward residents. Those that are still living here struggle with that cost burden. So while their income is still low, the rents have increased on them. And then Black and Hispanic renters really have that disproportionate impact overall. So now that we've discussed kind of the background and what the need is, we want to talk about the different types of projects that can be funded with the Affordable Housing Trust Funds. There are really 4 major types of properties that could be, or projects that could be funded, which would be the development of new affordable rental housing. It could be the development of new affordable ownership housing, rehabilitation and conversion of existing housing, to affordable housing, and then development of emergency shelters and transitional housing if we have those special findings that determine that the development that would offset the impact of the development of market rate housing. I also want to mention that what would not be allowed, because the emphasis is increasing supply of housing, is that it doesn't include providing down payment assistance. So we want to start with the primary recommendation, what staff is proposing in terms of what types of projects to fund. And then I will explain in the next slide kind of the rationale of the projects that we're not recommending at this time, mostly due because of the limitation of funding. Really thinking about focusing our limited resources on the area of most need. So staff is recommending that the project type that be funded is new affordable rental housing. It will increase the supply at a price point where the deficiencies have been identified. So we can have projects hit those various income ranges from low income, very low to extremely low. And also we can require that certain percentage of units be set aside for permanent supportive housing. It can be structured really to meet that need that's been identified in our displacement study. As I mentioned, it's an eligible use of funds. It helps those cost burden residents. And it would really align with the Let's House Hayward plan that's currently in development by providing those units or a path to housing stability. So as we look at our efforts to provide temporary housing for people experiencing homelessness, we also need to think about creating more permanent units for people to transition to. And as people have this housing stability, it also helps them to cover all their basic needs or even start working to other financial goals, such as saving money for their education or saving money for home ownership, building better credit capacity. But first, we feel that with such instability, we need to stabilize community members in order to help them meet some of these goals.
Hey, Christina, can I just step in for 1 second here? I just want to emphasize a point because I think it's important, is that when you have the deed restricted rental housing, the rents are set at 30% of your income. Whereas a lot of, just to be really clear, when we say cost burden, it means a lot of these renter households are paying upwards. And Christina, you can know the numbers, but like sometimes 50% of their income. So by actually reducing the amount of money that they're having to spend on rent, it creates more stability, but also allows them to potentially save more or achieve other financial goals. So I just wanted to kind of make that clear in terms of how the cost burden piece connects to pathways to more stability and potentially home ownership for some people.
Right, and I do want to clarify, in most cases, it doesn't, they set the rents at an affordability level, and some people may pay more than 40% or 30% of their income on rent, but it's a better scenario than they're experiencing now with 50, 60, 70%. So any kind of cost savings you have on rent would then be applied to being able to meet other basic needs or kind of advancing education or home ownership goals. So thank you for that clarification. And also wanted to point out from our analysis, the rental housing in terms of what the city needs to provide is a lower cost per unit. Affordable rental projects can access state funding, tax credits, which means that the city only needs to provide a smaller percentage of the overall development costs. The other types of projects we explored were affordable ownership housing, rehabilitation and conversion, and shelters and transitional housing. With the affordable ownership housing, the primary issue is that it would providing this type of this housing opportunity really helps individuals who are more secure in their housing situation right now. We would be helping people who are more stable and have better capacity, financial capacity to afford their current rental housing. It's also a higher cost per unit for the city because there's not a lot of funding from the state. And when we look at how much that would cost us, we've estimated it costs about $150,000 to $350,000 per unit. We would be supporting the development of a very few units, somewhere between 14 and 28 units. So the impact that we would have with our limited amount of funds, the $4.4 million, is nowhere near the need that we've identified. In terms of rehabilitation and conversion projects, one of the concerns is that it doesn't actually increase the supply of housing. It may be shifting existing housing that's naturally affordable and just ensuring that it stays affordable, but doesn't necessarily increase the supply. It can also cause displacement. Even when we are targeting a building that have people that are predominantly low income, you may have renters that don't meet that qualification. And you have renters that may choose not to live there, so you might still have some displacement. And this type of project would not create any additional units for our RHNA compliance. The last type of project that we could fund would be shelters or transitional housing. As mentioned before, we would need to have special findings that it mitigates the impact of the development on market rate, the development of market rate housing. The city's been actively pursuing funding and received almost $4 million so far for this purpose. And we feel that in order to further our efforts, we need to also be creating permanent housing for individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And while the shelters in transition provide that temporary option, it doesn't supply the long-term stable housing. We also feel that we can work on helping with increased homeownership opportunities in other ways, as mentioned by the assistant city manager, really looking at starting with housing stability. So helping individuals achieve that housing stability with rents that are appropriate for their income, which then expands their ability to achieve other goals. So really getting people at that right price point to free up some of their income, make more disposable income that they could put towards their goal. It improves their ability to save, helps them, could improve their ability to have positive credit history, and also can help promote homebuyer education and financial counseling. So once you're less burdened by the cost of rent, free up time, being able to invest in your own education. The city has also applied for Cal Home funds for down payment assistance. Currently in our development pipeline, there are about 70 affordable ownership units priced at moderate income by private developers. So we do see a pipeline of projects coming along. We have a development agreement with Habitat for Humanity to develop 10 units of affordable ownership housing, which would be targeting low to moderate income households. And compared to how much development we've done in the last 10 years for rental, the city has produced over 2,000, almost 2,400 units of ownership housing. So relative to the number of rental units, that's only been about 458 units. We're also exploring tax defaulted properties and foreclosed properties in terms of being able to help transition or change those ownership types, and partnering with the East Bay Community Land Trust to see if there's a way to help them acquire the properties and convert them to land trust or cooperative housing. And we're evaluating this. We've applied for funds for a state planning grant to see if we can figure out a process and a program that would help transition these homes, if they've been tax defaulted or foreclosed, into the community land trust or another nonprofit, so that we can look at some of the long-term benefits of owning the home and really helping low-income households as well as moderate-income households transition from renters and into owners, so that they can take the benefit of the stability of ownership. But considering the limitation of funding and the great need for the renters in the city of Hayward, we really think we should use our existing funds to target rental housing. All right, so the next topic for conversation, and this is the second item we'll be looking for feedback on, is the process for allocating funds. And so we really identified 3 different options for allocating funds and have a recommendation that would combine some of these elements. So our recommendation is really to prioritize existing affordable housing projects, the city projects, which would support the completion of 242 rental units and 10 ownership units. Even though some of these projects would be returning to us for funding, it still has a very low on average per unit cost at $60,000 per unit. And I also want to explain that the reason why projects come back for funding is usually related to things beyond the developer's control, such as increase in the construction costs. Sometimes they identify environmental issues that need to be addressed. Or they've applied for a funding and they've only received a partial allocation of funding from the other source. So many times projects will also, I think in the case of our application process, you're awarded for leveraging more money, and so you come in with a lower number. And so they come back when we've really truly identified as much as they can get from these other resources, and then end up needing just additional money to get across the finish line. So these projects are really important that we look at, once they've exhausted all their resources, how can we make these go forward? And so we have a couple of projects who are just very close to going across that. I guess it's not a finish line, it's a construction start line. We're also looking at establishing an affordable housing development pipeline for anticipated funding. So just to clarify, the previous one is really looking at allocating those current existing funds. And the second item is really looking at anticipated funds and establishing a pipeline with projects that want to move forward in the city of Hayward. And it's a process where you would issue a NOFA and use the NOFA to identify the projects that really meet the city's housing priorities and projects that the city council could support and stand behind. So you then create a list of projects, and as we collect the inclusionary housing trust funds, we would then be able to allocate those projects sequentially based on our ranking and scoring list. And so it helps to expedite and move the projects forward. As an alternative, we could require that the city projects, the existing city projects and these new projects compete for the available funds, which means you would issue a NOFA and both types of projects would compete so that you determine if you want to fund the existing projects over the newer ones, or maybe there's a newer one over the older one. One of the disadvantages of this is that you have your projects reapplying and getting reevaluation compared to new projects, and you may not move those projects forward. We think it's more streamlined just to look at, we've already committed to these projects that are going forward, and maybe look at a different process for new projects. And lastly, we can also do a more conservative approach where we look at postponing the NOFA instead of issuing a NOFA based on a pipeline. But if we postpone, we could wait until we had sufficient funds available to fund at least one new project. And based on our analysis, our research on the existing pipeline, it looks like we would need approximately $7 million to do that. So staff's overall recommendation is to combine items 1 and 2, where we would allocate our existing funds to the current city projects. And so we can usher those to the construction start. I know several of them are very, or I guess a couple of them are very close. And then also issue a NOFA so that we could establish this pipeline so that we could accelerate that funding process. This next section, I'm really going to speak high level on the NOFA and what we would propose as the major changes. The NOFA has 2 main components, which are your threshold criteria, what's required of the project, and then what the city is prioritizing. So we set up scoring system that ranks the scoring based on these different prioritizations. So the more that a project meets these categories, the higher they score, the higher they are on the list. And the lower that they score, the less they meet kind of what the city has established as their priorities. But you set these baseline requirements so that you can make sure that the projects would include units for extremely low income households, that a project has site control so that we're not doing any kind of speculative investment into a project that doesn't actually have the authority to be able to develop on that property. We require community engagement. We would establish a maximum loan amount just so that we can set a ceiling, look at a minimum number of units that have to be developed, and what our affordability targets are. And then prioritization, we're looking at, how ready is the project? You really want to prioritize something that's closer to being shovel ready than something that might take longer in the process, because then your money's sitting and waiting until it goes to construction. How much other funds it can leverage, what are how close a project is to different amenities in the community, such as grocery store, pharmacy, hospital, education to schools, if it's a project for families, if it's a project for seniors, senior centers. Look at what different special needs populations they're targeting, identifying housing for families that typically need larger unit sizes, what the developer capacity is, and to meet the city's sustainability goals. Can they exceed any of our existing requirements? And what other kind of project innovations they have. So since our last NOFA, the major change is that these projects would not be competing for County Measure A1 funds since we've already committed those funds. So we would end up modifying some of the requirements that were imposed upon us by the Measure A1 funds, just so that they're more consistent with the City of Hayward's priorities. We're also looking at making a more robust community engagement process. So the last NOFA did require that they host community meetings, but we're looking at ways to make that even more robust about notifying residents around the community about any discussions about the projects at City Council, and possibly figuring out a way if we can have a component that community residents score the applications. So we get feedback from residents that we could incorporate into the scoring process. And then also prioritizing projects, giving them points for organizations that have racial equity plans. So looking at this from a race equity lens, how do we ensure that organizations are also thinking about race equity in terms of the way they're providing service, or even the makeup of the decision makers or the executive team in their organizations compared to the people they serve. Okay, to summarize, after all of that, the final recommendation. So what staff is recommending is that we fund the new construction of affordable rental housing. Really, the main point is to increase the supply of housing at that price point where we've identified the need, which would improve housing stability. Really protecting vulnerable residents in the City of Hayward, of vulnerable renters. And also kind of creating this bridge between the Let's House Hayward plan and giving permanent opportunities for stable rental housing. And then creating that economic stability that we discussed so that people can achieve other financial goals. There have been lots of studies on how just providing this stability gives people more opportunity instead of focusing their efforts and energy on just trying to stay housed. In terms of, we also want to prioritize funding these existing city projects. This would ensure that we could create 99 more rental units in the City of Hayward at low, very low and extremely low income levels. And just with the additional projects that we have, it moves 143 units closer to that construction start and ensures that we really get closer to hitting those targets on our RHNA numbers. And then lastly, we think it's important to continue this idea of a pipeline where we're attracting interest from developers. They're seeing this as a viable place to provide affordable housing, and creating this space where we have projects just continually coming to us and being able to get funded. So this would accelerate the funding process. It would produce more units faster and prevent our funds from being idle. So as we do like a NOFA every 2 years, every 3 years, in the interim, the money stay idle and waiting for the next NOFA. This is a way to keep the money going out as quickly as it's coming in. And it also reduces staff time and the developer's time and costs in associating with applying for a NOFA multiple times. So for a lot of notices of funding availability, if you have it annually, they have to reapply, and that's cost and time for both the city and the developer. So conclusion and next steps. So if the Homeless and Housing Task Force recommends funding existing projects, we would have formal funding requests from the developer, and we'd really look at those numbers and evaluate the feasibility, if that's the minimum amount that they need from the city, so that we can try to ensure that all of the city funded projects could move forward. And then we would request City Council authorization to fund the projects. So we would have to return to council for each of these projects. If the Homeless and Housing Task Force recommends issuing a NOFA to establish a pipeline, then we would be looking at a process over the course of this year, from issuing the NOFA to the point where we return to council for funding approvals. which we anticipate to be prior to the end of the calendar year, so December 2021. And we would likely issue that NOFA as soon as May 2021. So that concludes my report, and I'm available for questions and discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's very illuminating. And just to be clear, and then I'll go to public comments, and then we'll have council questions and deliberation. The two items on the last slide are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? The staff recommendation is kind of both.
That's correct. So you can separate it. We gave you the 4 options, and we really could choose amongst those options. But our consolidated recommendation was to include number 1 and 2, but you could suggest any of those options.
Thank you. And I look forward to hearing from the community and my colleagues on exactly that. So at this point, I'll go to the public comments. And I know Ms. Tejada wanted to speak, and also Christy. Okay. Or Ms. Bascom, sorry. Yolanda?
Hello, good evening, City Council.
Oh, okay.
My name is Dolores Tejada. I'm with East Bay Housing Organizations. I'm the lead organizer. I also have lived in Hayward for a really long time. And I think the thing that I want to state is that our organization definitely agrees with the staff report that is prioritizing construction of new affordable housing and rental housing in the city of Oakland, specifically for extremely low income and low income households, in order to address the significant amounts of displacement and rent burden experienced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in the city, because that is what private developers who pay into the trust fund have paid the fee for, right? Funds should be prioritized for those with the deepest housing needs. And unfortunately, homeownership programs often really serve more of moderate income populations. So we think that a way to address the need of those who are most impacted, especially within the past year, is to continue to devote these funds to its intended purpose and to dedicate them to the construction of new affordable housing, rental housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bascom.
Thank you, members of the task force, and thank you to Ms. Morales for such a great presentation and so very thorough, explaining exactly what the task force is looking at. My name is Christy Bascom. I work with Habitat for Humanity.
Christy, you got muted.
Oops, sorry about that. Just wanted to speak up real quickly and appreciate the staff report and the work that the city is doing to enable and empower affordable housing to be built. As identified in the staff report, homeownership in the city of Hayward continues to be out of reach for so many current renters. The challenge is not only having the annual income that can support the monthly housing costs, but also the challenge of saving up for a down payment. So our ownership project, while small, will provide ownership townhomes for 10 households that are earning up to 80% of the area AMI. So the Habitat project is aiming to serve that low income 50 to 80% AMI category. So this project will allow 10 families to buy homes, establish roots, and provide secure housing for the long term. So just wanted to reiterate, we really appreciate everything that the city does to enable the construction of affordable housing, and Habitat supports staff's recommendation to use the funding to further support the existing city projects. We'll definitely put these additional funds, if awarded, to use getting the Sequoia Grove project off the ground. So thank you.
Thank you. Not seeing any other hands raised at this point, so we will close public comment. Thank you very much for those. And I'll go to my colleagues who I don't see any hands raised yet, but I'm betting that they have comments and questions. Go ahead, Mark.
So the people have spoken. Staff recommendation. So that's my question. Those are my comments. No. So, so the first question I have is, funding new construction. And I understand, those numbers, the more units we put out there, those numbers go towards our RENA goals. And I know I should know this, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. What happens to a local government who doesn't hit those RENA numbers?
So my understanding is it increases the types of projects that would be eligible for expedited approval under SB 35. There also may be funding implication in terms of applying for state funding. Cities that are identified as pro-housing will have receive more priority points in terms of funding. So it also helps us access state funding that would be available to develop affordable housing.
And what of the developments that we have going on right now, how much have we been able to leverage, or how much have we been able to benefit from projects that are either in the pipeline right now, or that are built or getting built right now? Do we know that?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but
well,
I put it in the staff report. But I think one thing is you can structure your NOFA so that you can set like a maximum loan amount based on development costs, so that you can know that, say, we only provide 10% of the needed funds, or 15% or 20%, which means you leverage the opposite. You leverage 80% of the funds.
The reason why I'm asking that is, I guess I'm asking, how successful are we if we were to, allocate funds to fund, existing projects, or to get projects online? How successful have we been with the funds now to get those projects off the ground, to get built? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, so the projects, I found the information. So current projects referenced in the report would leverage $170 million. Okay. So compared to the $12.6 million that the city's provided from our actual funds, plus the $18.3 million, I think, from the Measure A1 funds. So the proportion of what we provided compared to what they leverage in outside resources, and that includes private financing from banks, state funds, tax credits. So it's a lot of investment that comes into the city from the development of new housing, even the affordable housing.
So funding new construction is, certainly it just makes sense. And I can understand why you guys concluded that. The other question I've always wondered is, we have a lot of apartment buildings, I can name, Gadding and, Tyrell and Manning and stuff. And, some of these buildings are in deplorable condition. And if a building owner were to sell, or if somebody were to buy a building, how could that person and renovate it and rehab it? How would that person be able to access these kinds of dollars or these kinds of funding? Would they be able to access?
If somebody were trying to sell, a nonprofit developer could acquire the property, and then they would apply. If we did a notice of funding availability based on acquisition rehab, then you would be able to apply funding to help with the costs of the rehabilitation of that project. So it is possible to do that. It's a different type of project, and I think what we've looked at is that there's always, when you're dealing with acquiring occupied housing, there's a large risk of displacement of the existing residents. They may or may not income qualify for the new project, and those that don't may be displaced, or they can choose, if the developer is willing, they can choose to stay, and that usually means at a higher cost of the local subsidy, because the outside funding, like the state tax credits, wouldn't fund the development or rehab of that unit.
And Christina, I just want to correct me if I'm wrong, but they also don't necessarily count towards our arena, or do they if they're...
They do not count towards the arena, only if we identified it as a potential project. So looking at the upcoming cycle, if we could identify such projects ahead of time, then it would count. But for our current cycle, it would not.
So then, okay, I get that part, and yeah, and of course, there's a lot of rental housing stock right now that would be, great candidates that could be rehab, but and I understand that they won't count as our arena numbers, towards our arena numbers. The other question I had is, so if we were to allocate funds to current city projects, and I understand that what we have, sort of that are, in the queue or in the pipeline right now, where are the, where would they build? I mean, I guess I'm kind of looking at sort of the city right now and thinking, if we were, if we were to put out a NOFA, where where would potential projects land? I mean, we can't always, it seems like every time we have a project, we always go to the Caltrans sites, but there's, there's only so much land at Caltrans. I mean, where,
Yeah, so all of the current city projects have land. They've already acquired it. So for the existing city projects, that wouldn't be an issue. And for the projects that are on that pipeline that we identified, they've also identified sites already. So all of those projects have identified sites. They've looked at the feasibility of the project, and so we wouldn't have to be concerned about locating that site because they've done that already. And I think that with the NOFA, that's what we're looking for is projects that have already secured sites and have site control, so that we don't have that issue of awarding funds to a developer and then having to help them find a site.
Yeah. Well, and then lastly, I don't know what their plans are, and and I when I drive by it all the time, when I drive by it, I just think of the infinite possibilities I can go there. But it's the Kaiser site, the Mission or Tennyson and Hesperian, and if we were to, if we go this route and we put out a NOFA to get proposals out there, it'd be great to talk to Kaiser and see what Kaiser has, what their plans are. I mean, something that's high density, mixed use, office space, housing, that's a large swath of land near a college, near, right in the middle of two colleges, possibly. And so anyways, I just see a lot of interesting opportunities, and I don't know what Kaiser's going to do there. That's yet to be seen. But anyways, I'll wait till Councilmember Wahab speaks. But in terms of what you're asking for us, whether or not we want to do go along with the priorities, is that the question? Do we or do we not want to go with the priority? So yeah, I mean, it seems the what you've laid out seems pretty straightforward, and funding new construction sites seems to give us the bigger bang. So for the path we're going to take. So as of right now, of course, without listening to hearing from Wahab, that's where I'm going right now. So, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll circle back on the two questions at the end because. Councilmember Wahab.
Thank you. I kind of just want to start from the beginning. So with the staff report, I just really want to thank you guys for clearly writing a full sentence on the first page of the background that says funds cannot be spent on down payment assistance. That was the very first question I wanted to ask. So thank you for just clarifying that as clear as day. I wanted to ask about the in lieu fees. What is in the bank today?
So we have $4.4 million available in the affordable housing in lieu fees.
Okay. And so the staff report says as of February 28th, 2021, we have $475,000.
I have a typo in there. It should be, it should be $4.4 million that we have so far. Well, no,
Okay.
that we have of uncommitted funds.
$4 million, basically. Okay.
Yes.
And that's the number I've heard in the past. So I just wanted to ask, where did the money go? Right. So I appreciate that. And obviously we cannot do it for down payment assistance, which is a big push of mine. I would love to see. I heard our public comments in regards to the middle income. And I do want to be very clear, of course I support renters, but we also haven't, provided support for renters to be able to eventually own. And that has been a priority for me for this past year. So in regards to the plan that you guys have laid forward, I actually don't mind it. I would like to see some mixes a little bit. I liked some options here versus there. So if you don't mind going through the plan slides, and I know that you had you created in subsections, and we never got that. I never got the PowerPoint email, so I can't refer to it myself. Sorry.
It is posted, FYI, on the Legistar site.
Okay.
So you want me to share the slide again with the three options?
Yeah.
Do you want the three options, or do you want us to walk through staff's recommendation?
Just the staff recommendation per each
project.
The options. Sorry, if I'm being clear.
The 4 options.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Just because I just want to highlight the 1 or 2 things I like out of the other options, and then see if it's a possibility. Director Ott, I always ask you that. So if we can do more.
We'll try to be as creative as we can.
Yeah. And the reference to the 70 homes we would be potentially making, I just want to make sure. I know that we've gone back and forth. Is that related to our Caltrans properties or something else?
That is related to units developed as a result of the Affordable Housing Ordinance. So those would be on-site affordable units.
Okay, perfect.
And for some reason, I keep hitting that share button and nothing happens.
No worries, no worries.
User error here, I'm sure.
Okay, so I do believe that if we can move in parallel in regards to new construction and making sure that developers know that, hey, huge red flag on us, we definitely want to develop more. We want to make sure that it happens simultaneously. I want the public to understand that it usually takes a couple years before, a thought to final project in regards to development, especially multifamily projects. It takes a little bit longer. So I definitely want to do that in parallel if we can. And then as far as I appreciate the highlight of who is rent burden in Hayward. We do know it's obviously Black and Latino families primarily as the main target of who gets pushed out of the city of Hayward, as well as how much it has changed over the years. Housing has gone up, not down, and that has been a significant problem. As far as the new projects, I do believe that we should be focused on the multifamily projects. Is anything in regards to the social services aspect should be focused on the most needy. And we do know that that is a concern as of this moment in our economy, as well as our city. At the same time, I do want more development for affordable housing, home ownership opportunities. I'm not exactly sure how we can kind of fit that in together, but this is the part where I said I wanted kind of the simultaneous approach. The reason why is because, again, I do believe that, especially with our city and some of the problems that we see, is that if you do own, you feel a little bit more tied to the city. The kids don't have to necessarily move from school to school. And we need to kind of make those options more available to families, especially working families. So as much as we can, I appreciate the fact that we are kind of moving, I don't want to say like the emergency shelters. We've done a lot of work in the past couple years around shelters, but the problem with shelters, and as a person who's worked with domestic violence victims and so much more, they're temporary, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And, as we saw, even in Covenant House, it's roughly about 45 days. So it's a Band-Aid solution and not even a very strong Band-Aid. So as much as we do care about that, we have done some of that. We have opened our Homeless Navigation Center and more. So I do want to focus on kind of where the biggest impact is. Yeah, thank you.
Which slide would you like to see?
I think it's the one with the 4 options, Amy, that's a little before that. Is that right? Yeah, is that the one you're thinking?
Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I definitely want to complete the rental unit projects. In regards to, just highlighting the NOFA again, if we can do that simultaneously, I'm not sure if that's something possible. Director Ott, any feedback on that?
Or to complete the rental units?
The rental units, as well as, developing a pipeline for future projects and so much more.
Yeah, I think that's our recommendation, is to do 1 and 2 so that you get the 242, you get those 242 rental units over the finish line and 10 ownership units. So you do get a mix. It's and then also establish that pipeline so that, some of the points that you were making, that we can and that we really want to be more nimble and be able to kind of expedite projects and streamline them.
Okay. And then one of the things is, in the staff report, it says produce more units faster. I just want clarity on how.
Well, I think this gets at, and Christina is on number 2, by having an established pipeline, because fees come in, we don't control when the money comes in, right? It's when a developer comes and pulls building permit, and we can help them and walk them through everything. But at the end of the day, they have to get the financing and decide they want to build housing, market rate housing. And that's very dependent on the private market. And so when they come in, they pull their building permit, they have to pay their fees. And so those fees are hard to predict. And so by having this pipeline ready, when those fees come in, we can be more nimble. We don't have to stop, then do a notice of funding availability, then go to the council and get the money. We already have the kind of pipeline ready, and those funds, as they come in, can then be can be used to fund the projects that have already been prioritized by the council.
Okay. And then I just want to highlight that the attachment 2 of the staff report, where it says affordable housing developments with funding gaps, there's only one project regarding ownership, right? And pretty much all the rest, including the new projects, were all rental or /1 shelter. So I do just want to emphasize that we should kind of look to see if we can get some new projects also that promote ownership opportunities. So out of the new projects, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 new projects assigned, 1 for a shelter, 5 for just rental, and 2 of them designated for senior, 1 for teacher, which I absolutely love, and I hope that we can do that because teacher housing is priority in our city, but also ownership. If we can get a little bit more, proposals for ownership, I'd appreciate that effort. And then I hate to say it, but if we can kind of do a 2-bedroom, like also focus on kind of design wise, if we can, potentially, I'm not sure where we can have that, but I would like to see that. And then can you explain why the city funding needed for Habitat for Humanity is $0.2 million, I'm assuming, versus, some of the other numbers that are at 1 million plus?
Yeah, so we have already supported the development of the project by providing the land and $630,000 worth of assistance. They're actually intending to apply for Measure A1 funds. The last RFP for development is the ownership development, which is anticipated to happen later this year, probably in the fall. So they're looking to fund that bigger gap that they have, which I think is around $2 million, using the Measure A1 fund. which offsets the cost to the city.
Okay. And the reason I wanted to ask about the bedrooms or a little bit more for family projects as well is because lower income people tend to have more children. It's statistically been kind of the record. So if we can kind of identify that as one of the goals as well. Overall, and just to be brief, I do appreciate the options available. I think staff recommendations right on point. I appreciate the fact that you guys took a racial equity lens to it as well. That is incredibly important to identify. And I just want to be very clear. And I know that you guys tend to talk about it a lot, but when we're doing projects, if we can very clearly in one line just highlight this much money was taken from this, our trust fund, and we have this much left, because sometimes it gets kind of lost in the weeds. If we can do that in future conversation, and then overall, again, I think you guys are on point, and we'll see kind of like a cleaned up version of what we're talking about for a final commitment, correct?
Correct. So prior to committing any funds, we would have to get council approval. Yes.
Okay.
Even of this option.
Right. But just to be clear, I think, Christina, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're proposing that we would, based on this recommendation, start working with the city projects in that option number one, start working with them to really hone in on how much money they need, try to get that as small as possible so we can use as much of our funds on other things as possible. And then we would bring those individually back to the council for approval based on the task force recommendation. Is that correct, Christina? That's what you were thinking. And then the NOFA, the idea of that, the actual NOFA document and what that would go to the council for kind of final blessing before issuance, right, Christina?
Correct.
So there's kind of, it would go back to, the council get to see it, but it would kind of come back in two different ways. Not all, 1 and 2 wouldn't come at once as one package.
Definitely. And then one question, how we provide the land for certain developments, especially affordable, or are we also able to waive some of the city fees for them as well?
Well, park fee for 100% affordable projects, park fees they do not have to pay park fees.
But beyond that, we don't do anything else.
There's not, we don't really have other fees other than utility fees. And we don't have the ability, Christine, you can correct me if I'm wrong, to waive them necessarily, but we are looking at ways that we could potentially postpone when they get funded, potentially to occupancy, or maybe even deferred over a longer period of time to help the development out. But we don't currently have a process for waiving our utility fees. Otherwise, the city doesn't have other impact fees.
Okay. Yeah. If we are able to do that, in addition to what we're doing now, just to make it as, 1, affordable housing is the priority. Number 2, the city's willing to work with some of these fees, even if we can't waive it, but if we can kind of reduce it or delay it. I think that is also something to look into, but those are my comments, and I don't really have any further questions. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So I have sorry, I was just trying to figure out where I wanted to start. So I think I'm going to start with a recommendation, which I think gets us where we want to go, but I want to give a little bit of background why so this is coming from both what I heard both of my colleagues say, as well as my own input on the matter. Which is, so it sounds like we're all agreed that spending existing money on current projects is definitely where we want to go. That's part 1. Am I reading that right? I'm seeing Mark nod.
Yeah, I'd like to see things completed.
Right. Okay. So great. In order to get things completed, and for the reasons laid out in the staff report, sounds like everybody's consensus about using existing funds for existing projects. Great. And then the other proposal on the table that I think I heard support for was, and also from the community, is to do a NOFA. The piece that I'm not sure we have consensus on, but what I'm hoping we can have consensus on, is actually having that NOFA be, and sorry, Amy, are you controlling the slides?
Yes, I am. What slide would you like?
May I have slide 16, please? The project types to fund. Perfect. Thank you, ma'am. So the funds can be used for all of this. And the case was well made, I think, about why we don't want to use current funds for this. It's not a lot of bang for a buck, et cetera, et cetera. But if what we're creating is a pipeline, what I personally would like to see, and I think this speaks to both Mark's point and Aisha's point about having some options, is I'd really like to see a pipeline that actually does, and a NOFA that does allow for these. I realize that may take more staff time to go through the proposals, but the reason that I think it's a good idea is that this pipeline could also allow opportunities for other kinds of funding, you know, as the city applies for home fund. I mean, knowing that there was a council interest in, and correct me if I'm wrong, but knowing there was a council interest in home ownership and down payment assistance, then when those funds became available, the application became available, that sort of became a target. Knowing that there is a need for student housing facilitates collaboration around that. So personally, what I'd like to see to make that simpler is that we don't limit the NOFA to just creation of new affordable rental housing, that we allow it for affordable ownership, rehab, and I want to say a little bit more about that, kind of building on Mark's points earlier, and then even emergency shelter. Is that, so I'll stop there and ask for consensus from my colleagues on that, and then I'll say a couple other things. So I see Aisha.
Yeah, I have a question for Director Ott, if that's the case. The attachment 3 for affordable housing notice of funding availability, the NOFA, threshold and scoring criteria. Who is that developed by?
That's developed by staff, so Christina and her staff.
Okay.
It was developed by staff and it was approved by city council prior to the last NOFA. So we would seek approval of those criteria again.
Okay. So I personally would be interested in making it as broad to fund, you know, basically all of this, plus whatever else we can do to make it, as Councilmember Lamnin would like, to more opportunities, if you will.
And I'd just like to invite Christina to kind of talk, because it is different criteria for home ownership versus rental. And so maybe Christina, talk about how it would work if you were to have kind of both be in a NOFA, and just some of just to kind of share more on the technical side, how you'd balance that.
You're really going to give me a license to talk about all the technical side?
Well, no, I'll strike the word technical. And
technical's okay. Brief is important.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah,
I just want to make sure that we all understand what that means in terms of prioritizing and two different types of projects and how that would work.
Yeah, they really have different financing models and structures, so they have to be evaluated separately. So you can't score a rental project and an ownership project and a rehabilitation project in the same scoring criteria because they're evaluated differently. So you would set up separate criteria for each type. You can do it so it's one NOFA with these different criteria, and then you rank them based on percent points achieved. But it does mean developing different sets of criterias, evaluating them in different ways, and then having that discussion in terms of the pipeline. What are the priorities? Because they're going to rank differently, but they're also going to have different levels of impact.
And when you say rank, is it all in one shot, or can it be separated in the sense of like, oh, I'm a developer that's interested in just creating ownership opportunities, and okay, this is the city of Hayward's NOFA, and this is how I'm going to answer all these questions, and then be ranked just on the home ownership opportunity, and then, you know, the renting opportunity separate, like not ranked against each other?
The idea is that they receive a score based on the criteria for that specific project. But then instead of lining up those scores, because maybe the total points in a home ownership is lower than a rental, you would rank them on a percentage. The reason for that is kind of setting a priority order. But the way we evaluated this last time is we actually also looked at the projects with greater impact, and we've adjusted it based on the housing needs. But it's a tool to evaluate the pool of projects, figure out which ones most meet the priorities of the city, and then see how they compare to each other. Because you'll want to kind of explore what are the development costs, the cost per unit to the city, how much bang for the city's buck are we getting? So if we're looking at developing, you might say, oh, well, this project will only require $5 million, but it's only going to fund 3 units versus this other project will require $5 million from the city, but will develop 75 units. So we would evaluate things like that, especially in the context of looking at these different project types and how they relate to each other. But it's definitely a separate scoring process, and we would probably, Jennifer could acknowledge as she first came here, all the different ways we evaluated funding the various projects.
Just to, and maybe Christina, this is just kind of, we can brainstorm a little if you don't mind, but I think just to, because for instance, there are the Cal Home funds, and one of the options in the Cal Home funds is to fund actual affordable home ownership projects. Is that right, Christina?
So yeah, so for future Cal Home funds, if we were applying, we could partner with an affordable housing developer that has a site that they that they own, and see if we could apply with them for the Cal Home projects. Right. And then also, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that if we created a pipeline of affordable home ownership projects as well, which is what I hear kind of maybe the task force saying, is that even if some of them maybe some of the affordable home ownership don't stack up, ultimately the council decides what you fund, right? But if just even having a pipeline of affordable home ownership projects might help us leverage other state funds or be ready to take advantage of those other state funds, even if ultimately the council decides to fund the rental project because it has the lowest per unit subsidy and it has the most leverage. So it may be that ultimately those NOFA funds go towards the rental housing, but we still now have a pipeline and have identified affordable homeownership projects that we can try to also work to fund. Is that?
That is the intent that I was talking about. And actually, I would talk about all 4 categories, and I realize that adds levels of complexity, but it is exactly as you're describing, Jennifer, that as my intent is that we sort of cast this broad net so that we know so that as various funds come in, we can be ready to jump.
And I agree. My whole thing is that also for me, and I understand you guys are looking at, funding and as you guys wrote, readiness and leveraging and so forth. I also want to see impact on density and the number of units. Those are the things that I would be looking at. I know you guys are looking at other things as well, but obviously I want to see the impact, right? If we are going to fund a project, and I hate to say it, but I would not be interested in funding 3 units versus something that I would be very interested in funding 75, 100 plus units, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I would be looking at as what is the priority impact for the city and the residents.
Right, and that's the criteria that Christina was talking about earlier.
Yeah. So. And so if maybe, I think we understand the recommendation. I'll give Christina a chance to kind of clarify anything, but also just to give us a little latitude, because when we actually have to write it up and create the practical criteria, there may be some need to kind of get some additional feedback, or when we bring it to council to get a little more kind of direction from you. But we understand conceptually what you want, but sometimes questions come up when we try to create the practical document to do it. So I don't know, Christina, do you have more clarifying questions, or do you kind of understand what the hope is?
And I also want to let Mark weigh in too. So go ahead, Christina, and then Mark.
Yeah, I understand that you want to kind of cast a broad net for all of these different types of projects to see what is available in terms of projects to fund, and then evaluate what that pipeline would look like. So I think we could, and as Jennifer said, we may have to, as we're trying to navigate, because I don't think I've never done one with emergency shelters in there before. So it may take a kind of a little evaluation on how we integrate that into this whole NOFA process.
And for that one, I actually would think more of the transitional housing. I'm thinking about, we had Youth Spared Artworks Youth Housing come testify before this body a few months ago. I know First Presbyterian Firm Foundation has some tiny home model based on the one in Castro Valley. The sort of, when I'm thinking about that particular line, I'm looking more at the transitional housing personally than the emergency shelter necessarily, like the more traditional emergency shelter.
And I guess I do have one clarifying question, especially as we look at emergency shelters and transitional housing. Are we looking at projects that have site control, which is pretty standard for the top three? So I want to just clarify that would be the expectation, that they would have to have a site in order to be eligible to apply for funds.
Yeah, I would think so, personally.
That would certainly be my recommendation.
Yeah, I think the shovel-ready lens is the value of this pipeline, personally. But
and I guess oh, sorry, you were going to, Councilmember Salinas. I just had another thought, but I can wait.
I appreciate this collaborative brainstorming with both of my colleagues and with staff. Go ahead, Mark.
No, go ahead, Jennifer. I'm listening.
Okay, no, I just wanted to say, I think what I'm hearing just is that it's pretty easy to rank within each of these types, right? But what gets a little trickier and harder is when you start trying to rank them across the types, because they're very different. Homeownership actually is a lot less dense because they tend to have a lot bigger subsidies. And so I think that's what the trick's going to be for us to think about, and the council ultimately to decide, is how are you going to rank the rental homeownership? And maybe Christina has some ideas, but I think it's going to be that's going to be the challenge, is picking and choosing from the different categories. But let us go back and think about it and kind of give it some more thought and try to come up with a way to address what I think we're hearing you say. So thank you. Sorry.
I think this is my personal opinion, again, that it be separated, ranked amongst, their own criteria or their own group, if you will. And then based on what the city council decides is the need of the community at that time, so for example, I know at one point we needed a shelter, right? Or even a homeless navigation center, or whatever the case may be, or we need a little bit more affordable housing for a specific demographic, right? Extremely low, moderate, whatever the case may be. I think that it should be separated, and then based on what city council wants to do for the need of the community at that time, I think that's how it should be brought to council, and saying, these are our top couple in each category. What is the direction? Because we have, let's say, $5 million, right? And we could potentially fund these three 100%, or we can only, do option number 4 at 75%. I think that's kind of like how I would like to see it, because it allows the broad range to be presented to council, and it's a little bit flexible on city desires and needs at the time.
Interesting. Okay.
Well,
jump on in, Mark.
Yeah. So, just on that last comment right there, I was thinking, so I know this was on there, but it really wasn't talked about too much, was that last point of having just essentially pausing NOFA, right? Just delaying it and waiting for, and postponing NOFA and see how much more we can generate in this bucket. I don't know how long we would pause it. What would be a pause, what would be a pausing timeline? 2 years, 3 years?
I mean, I think as Jennifer, as the assistant city manager discussed, that it's hard to tell because we don't know when the market rate housing will go to construction and pull permits, and that's really the trigger for payment. So we know that we have $1.7 million invoiced right now. We don't know how long it would take to get to a point where we could probably fund multiple projects. So a potential benchmark would be to wait until we have about $7 million, which is basing on the funding gaps of these new projects. It would fund the gap of one of the smaller requests on the pipeline. So that could take us years.
Yeah. Well, so, so I want to go back to, the slide you had about, the where homeownership begins. And, homeownership begins with stable housing, right? And so how do we, yeah, there you go. So how do we get to stable housing? Well, it's getting as many rental, it's basically getting folks stable, right? Rental housing, having affordable rental housing, having, if it's shelters, having folks be able to transition to something more permanent. So, I think what we're talking about right now certainly covers all of the bases, at least when we're looking at home ownership. I know not everyone's going to, pursue home ownership, but, I think for me, the main goal is to produce as many rental units as possible. I agree with Councilmember Wahab. Should there be a parallel track on for home ownership? We do have a parallel track right now, but of course it's market rate, and it's not as it isn't necessarily affordable to a lot of folks. But if we can create that parallel track, absolutely, that's just putting more developments in the pipeline. But so I guess in short, what I'm trying to say is I agree with both, Jennifer Ott and Councilmember Lamnin. And so, yeah, I would agree to that.
The broader net.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank all four of you as I'm looking at you. I appreciate this dialogue. And a couple other things I just wanted to comment on. Is, I think, Mark, earlier you brought up about the rehab, and Christina, you mentioned about being able to identify those projects early. And so I'm hopeful that's part of why I want to have the rehab opportunity in this, so that perhaps we could identify those. The question I had was, does, if a property transitioned into affordable, would we lose that number off of the market rate? Because I'm not
for the RENA, right? Are you talking about
for the RENA? Sorry, thank you. Yes.
I mean, if a project is converted from market rate to affordable, it wouldn't affect the RENA compliance at all. So it wouldn't add units and it wouldn't detract, because the market rate units that are reflected in the RENA are newly developed units.
Okay, but you did mention if we were able to identify them earlier.
That's correct. So for the next cycle, if we identified potential projects for rehab, then in conversion to affordable housing, then it counts towards the RENA allocation.
Okay.
We are going into a housing element cycle over the next year. So I think to the extent there was a pipeline that showed what those are, I mean, that could be something we could look at, including in the housing element. But they'd still obviously need funding, right? And public subsidy to make them work. And I just also want to, I think everyone knows this, but just maybe to be clear, is that when you see that third bullet, the 70 affordable homeownership units come from the other part of our ordinance, which is the inclusionary on-site. And a lot of those projects are coming in with affordable homeownership inclusionary units. So one of the reasons you see us kind of strongly, recommending the rental is for all the reasons that we've shown in the data, but also because you're getting a lot of those ownership units through the on-site inclusionary. And so using the fees to really leverage the rental units that tend to really leverage a lot more density and a lot more units and help that vulnerable population. So I just wanted to remind us of that kind of balancing between the ordinance.
Absolutely. And what I think I'm also hearing from my colleagues, and I support, is kind of a priority for the in lieu fees is the rental side of the house, but having the NOFA that allows us to hear what all of those projects are may prioritize other funding opportunity
I think it's
match.
Great idea. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate all of that. And just a couple of observations. It sounds really clear. We keep coming up with this. We need to stop building market rate units, and yet we rely on them to subsidize our affordability. So I don't know the solution to that, but I throw it on the table for my colleagues to consider. And I know staff's already wrangling with that. And then I also really appreciated, Mark, you raised about the the Kaiser site. And if this NOFA becomes an opportunity to catalyze some of these sites, I mean, Kaiser has some priority, I think, around healthcare as housing, or housing as healthcare. Sorry, I said that backwards. And so, you know, put your money where your mouth is, Kaiser. Let's develop that site. We have some of those other sites that, as Mark said, we drive past all the time. Yeah. And then kind of to Councilmember Wahab's point about bang for the buck and impact, you know, having things that require one-time subsidy as opposed to on-time multiple subsidies or needing to cobble together are certainly things that are priorities for me. Okay. Anything else either from my colleagues or from staff on this item?
Yeah, I also wanted to talk about partnerships in regards to, so I know I've talked to our city manager, and I want to say Director Ott, yourself as well, and I apologize for keep calling you Director Ott. I just got so used to it. So Assistant City Manager Ott, and please correct me in future. So I
as long as I know who that you're, just you got the Ott in there, that's good enough.
No, I appreciate that. But out of respect, I just want to get used to saying it. The tax defaulted properties, right? That is something I'm very much interested in. The fact that it was shocking at how basically we could purchase these different properties for almost a fraction of the cost is ridiculous, right? Even if we were to make that and create that as a home ownership opportunity for families, and depending on the size of the home and so forth, and prioritizing that, if we work with, I don't know if there's an organization that not only rehabs, but then also has a list of people that can apply where the let's say the work is not done on the city staff part, because we obviously have a very small housing department or unit. That's number one. And then also, the Housing Authority of Alameda County. So individuals that are highly in need, obviously, you know, are seeking to get on housing through Alameda County. However, it is very difficult. You know, there's a wait list. There's, you know, years of waiting for some people. Sometimes it's out of the area that they live in. It's like in, you know, some of the new developments in the Tri-Valley, so forth. I'm not sure what we can do, but even just thinking a little bit outside of the box and touching some of these more older systems and processes and seeing if we can develop something new in that, I think that's incredibly important. And just as much as we can, if the way that you guys looked at the racial equity, and again, I don't have the PowerPoint in front of me, but and the PowerPoint's not on Granicus, at least not my account, but the racial equity is incredibly important, but when we are targeting specific demographics, so we do this for seniors, right? I think I saw something for teachers, but we don't necessarily do it for any other type of clear demographic. And I know that we have like equal housing opportunity rules and, you know, biases and laws around that, but students and teachers have to be a priority on a couple of our projects. I know that we've tried to, and I know we've been restricted from not specifically designating it for them, but we do need a project specifically for student and teacher housing, especially the closer we are to Cal State East Bay or Chabot.
I also if you'd like just to respond, it's something we could have a conversation with the school district, because it has to happen on school district land or with school district kind of financing. And so there are ways to do that can, you know, and you can work with developers that specialize in that. So it's something I'm happy to try to have a conversation with the school district, because that's the best way to kind of really focus housing on teachers, is to work directly with a school district. So I think it's a great idea, and we're happy to kind of have those conversations.
Yeah, thank you. That's all I have for this item.
Thank you. I see you, Mark. And I just want to add quickly that, yeah, it might be great to have a student teacher housing conversation, maybe in HLAC, but also invite Cal State and Chabot to that conversation as well. Mark.
Yeah, you know, the discussion of teacher, you know, of teacher housing is not a new one. There was the school district generated a report. I don't know, 5-6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, and they made that report exists. The school district has it, and what it did was it was a land assessment of, I don't know how many properties. They didn't do all of them, but they did some key properties that were large properties. For example, I think one of them was the Glassbrook School property. Glassbrook School is an incredibly large parcel of land. I mean, you could literally split that footprint in half and probably build an entire, complex for teachers. And so, anyways, I say all of that because that conversation starter, perhaps, it isn't too, it's not too far away from us. All we need to do is pull that report out, look at it, and see what the, what the recommendations were 7 or so years ago. I think it was about 6 years ago, but.
Yeah, no need to reinvent the wheel. So thank you for that reminder. Thank you both for this conversation. It's been really productive, and thank all 4 of you for that. Really appreciate the collaborative thinking on this item. Unless there's anything else, we will move on, and I've had all different windows open to track what we're doing here. So let me go back to the agenda. Okay, so that brings us to future agenda items. We have the tentative schedule in our agenda. And is there anything that staff wants to say about any of these items? Seeing Jennifer shake her head. Okay, then I'll turn to my colleagues. Go ahead, Aisha.
Thank you. To Assistant City Manager Ott, I wanted to ask, okay, so September 2nd says housing element. And I just want to be clear because I would like to change our affordable housing percentage for multifamily units as well as single family units. I think it's long overdue. And I know that you referenced it in the staff report of the last item as part of kind of briefly, if you will. When can we make those adjustments? I know council in the past has also slightly talked about it. I know it's a long-term kind of a thing. Can you shed any light to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's again a issue of competing priorities and resources. I think this NOFA and the effort that it takes to do something like that is a pretty significant effort. And so I think we are really going to be, in addition, it's not like we're managing the rent relief program and we're managing the rent, even though the rent stabilization ordinance is no longer on your plate, it's still on staff's plate to implement and manage. And so I think, we've talked about it. I think we want to focus on the NOFA. And I think also that affordable housing ordinance is just now kind of getting phased completely in. So we don't even have complete data on the ordinance and the way that it's been performing. And Christina can, if I get that wrong, but I think is that we're still kind of waiting to see how this existing ordinance performs. So we're a little concerned about bringing forward changes right now and try to do the NOFA all at the same time and the Let's House Hayward plan. So I think we are looking to see if that's something we could potentially get started next calendar year, maybe still within next fiscal year, and we will do that. I think staff also, to be honest, we have concerns and the state is starting to regulate increasing percentages because it actually puts more of a financial burden on housing and makes it harder to build housing when you create too much of a burden on the of affordable housing because it's very expensive and it takes away from the financial feasibility of projects. And so the state is actually watching and kind of regulating cities and they're changing that number. But I think we want to share. And so we really want to actually share with you a lot of these trade-offs, just like we did in this staff report for that ordinance and making sure that you're making a really informed decision about changing that percentage or doing more on-site affordable versus fees. Because if you don't have fees, we can't do what we're doing right now. And so there's a lot of trade-offs. So I think we are looking to try to bring that back sometime next calendar year. But I think
Is
we're
it
really
September 2nd? Is that the piece?
no housing element is we're kicking off. The state has handed down a new allocation of regional housing need.
Okay.
And it's like, I think it's like over 4,000 units for Hayward that need to get planned. And part of that, I just want to kind of is we've gotten a lot of money and grant money to actually expand that to really look at some ways to incentivize housing. So for instance, a grant to do tax defaulted property program, to look at whether or not we want to reevaluate single family zoning in the city or not. I mean, so to really, and so we're going to, that's going to take a lot of staff resources, mostly in development services, but Christine and her staff have to support that effort.
Okay.
As well.
And I want to be clear, I'm not opposed to the in lieu fees. And even if we did increase the percentage, they are still able to pay the in lieu fees, even if they didn't complete the full percentage, right? We know that there's variations there. So when you talk about, the trade-offs, it's designed in it already. So also they can, developer can also kind of have some flexibility. But the reason why I say this is because many of our neighboring neighbors are actually either higher than us, and even cities that you wouldn't think have higher affordable housing percentages. So I do want to highlight that these numbers, even the fact that it was fairly recent, right, before my time, but still fairly recent, still very low compared to even our neighbors, even our more conservative anti-housing neighbors, right? Mm-hmm. So I do want to highlight that also because it is for new development, incredibly important that we highlight affordability as kind of the key piece for any new project. And if they aren't able to do the on-site development of affordable housing, that they pay their fee, and it's even more increased because of the percentage increase, right? So I do just want to highlight that piece of it, especially as I'm assuming we're going to try to look at more infill development and hopefully higher density.
Yeah, I mean, and so we will, what I can tell you is that we hear loud and clear. We saw on the roadmap that was a priority. We are struggling a little bit with capacity, and we saw that. And so what I can tell you is that we will try to bring it as soon as we can, which, I think, we need to focus on the NOFA, getting the housing element started, but we will look at to see if we can bring it back kind of the later part, or at least start the conversation about it next kind of the end of this upcoming fiscal year. So kind of 2022, and we will try, and I understand that, but because all the things you just said, for instance, adding a higher percentage for higher density actually costs more to build and actually has less profit to really be able to spend on affordable housing. So the units that can afford more, inclusionary units is actually ownership, lower density ownership product, right? But those are also the ones that can afford more fee that you could then use to subsidize more rental housing. So it's a very complicated, economic thing. And I want to make sure that the council has all that information to be able to judge.
100%. The reason why I ask is because I know some residents were told in roughly 1 to 2 to 3 months, this would potentially be brought to council. And it has been about 2 months since that individual asked. It was some conversation regarding the planning commission and pulling an item and, hopefully talking about this. So I wanted to know about that. Number two, I think 2022 is pretty late. Definitely, I would suggest asking for an extra body for this upcoming funding cycle if that is needed. Housing is a priority. And the reason why I say for new development is because regardless of how much we care about the affordable piece, and that obviously is a priority, the next piece is also increasing development, period, right? So whether it is higher density or things like that, we do have to increase the numbers. The numbers even for the parcels, to me, have always been very low, considering that it's like 30 acres here, 15, 20 acres there. It's very low. And in Milpitas, they did a project that's like, I think, I want to say 10,000 units, but it was something very, very large for the amount of space. I'm not saying let's do 10,000. I'm just saying that, we have to be considerate of providing more housing as an option as well.
Yeah, no, and I understand that. And I think with public land, the city also has the goal of trying to maximize land value, right? And use money that can be unrestricted, that can be used for other things. And so increasing the percentage of affordable housing actually decreases land value. And so we just have a lot of competing interests. And so, and I think if you're talking about the Milpitas side, is that around BART also?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, that is a
No,
very
I
strong.
completely get it. I'm just saying example wise for future, and I'm not saying public lands. I'm just saying for, the private development, we should put a little more pressure to do more.
I think we would love to do more multifamily housing. I think, I've talked recently to multifamily brokers. It's, hopefully with Lincoln Landing, maybe there's kind of a more proven market. We could get some new rental rates that show that it's feasible, that we can try to use to maybe incentivize the multifamily housing on the city center site. I mean, I think we would love to do it. I think it's a challenging product type given construction costs, the cost of lumber right now. But we agree with you. We'd like to get more density.
Perfect. And then last year, actually 2 years ago now, potentially, I know we talked about a first right of refusal, and then it just went away. So I just want to know where that's at.
Well, I think we included it when we came back to you with a work session on affordable home ownership options. It was one of the alternatives that we talked about and looked at and discussed. I think what we recommended then was that it is a program that if it's not coupled with funds, both in terms of administration and actually supporting tenants, and Christina can correct me, or supporting new homeowners, the programs that have been most successful, I think it was Washington, D.C., had very significant staff resources, like a whole department to kind of manage this program, plus funds to help support new owners to be successful in those units. And so I think when we had that work session, I think our recommendation was not to do that right now, given all the other things we want to do and the administrative cost and of setting up a whole new program like that.
The
If
funds
that's
from
something,
the housing trust, can it be used for that?
Yeah, I mean, it could be used it would be similar to an acquisition rehab when you convert to long-term affordability covenants on the property. But when we were looking at the amount of funds that were being used for this program, we were talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. So you'd establish a program to fund one project, or like to establish legislation, and then you can only fund one project. It would put a lot of requirements in there without the benefit of actually transitioning people to home ownership, or even in some cases, the right of first refusal transition to other rental options. So there's that kind of to weigh the cost and the benefit of it, of imposing a really strict legislation that has restrictions on how you sell a property, and then not actually being able to help people own their home or have a tenant-owned building. There's also the legal requirements that the Washington, D.C. helped with legal assistance for how you get those mechanisms in place to acquire the property as a group of people. So there's like 3 components that the city funded in order for those projects to be successful.
I think one of the reasons I just want to add that we're really focused on this idea of a tax defaulted or foreclosed property program is because we think we can achieve, maybe not, we can actually achieve some of the same things, but without kind of regulating all units. And we can focus on the ones that actually are potentially more economical, because if they're tax defaulted, you might only have to pay the tax amount to acquire the unit. And so that's why we're really focused. That's why Christina has applied for a grant from the state to try to create this program, have a consultant help us think about how to do that right, potentially explore that partnership with the land trust that's also really wanting to start to kind of explore Hayward. And we think we can target a program that has less impact on staff resources, achieve the same thing, and really focus on the units that are potentially, most at risk of kind of getting lost in the shuffle or having problems. And so that was why I think we're really focused on trying to create that type of program. And that is something that we're actively pursuing.
And what's the timeline around that?
Well, we're hoping to see if we get this grant. We don't know yet. If we get the grant, then I think we can expedite a little faster. If we don't, then I think it's something, I think, Christina, you can correct me, that we're trying to at least start thinking about this. I mean, this year, trying to think about a program to sign for this year. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. Okay.
I appreciate it. It's just, obviously, and I think our city manager actually told me kind of like, we're going to pause on this for a minute because it's, you guys want to go with such a robust program. I do appreciate all the work you guys do. I know that, housing has been kind of the big pressure for you guys. So I appreciate that. And I don't want to add too much pressure, but this is obviously the most important thing for me. So again, thank you and your entire department that work on this. I know there's a lot of people that work kind of in the shadows on this. So again, thank you for everything. And I appreciate all the work you guys do.
Thank you. And if I could just along those lines, I would love to, this staff report and this work was very collaborative with almost the entire housing division. And so I do want to acknowledge, Jane Kim's on the line, Amy Cole, Deanna. So I just want to, I want to emphasize what you said, Councilmember Wahab, that this was a team effort and really want to appreciate them.
Definitely. And I just appreciate all the research you guys do. I'll be honest with you, out of all the staff reports, and I know I've asked for more data and you guys provide, 15-page plus staff reports. I know that's whittled down from God knows how many actual pages you guys actually really wrote up. So thank you again for that. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I wanted to echo that comment. This was a very nice staff report. I think stuff that I've always looked for, and stuff that I know we've been talking about, and stuff that we've been talking through, particularly with our strategic roadmap planning and our staff planning, council planning. I think it reflects a lot of those elements that we've been talking about. So thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the work. And as you said, Mark, very reflective of all of some previous conversations, and good to have this data. I appreciate the work on the displacement study. I think there's a lot there that we'll be basing policy on in the future. Is that going to be provided to council at large, or how does that, what's the next step with that study?
So we hadn't intended to bring it back to council at large, but would suspect that we could come to, Jen, do you think we could bring it back to the committee for more information about it, to the Homeless and Housing Task Force, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a study that we have to do to comply with the county's requirements to get our Measure A1 funds. So we want to get it done quickly, but I think we absolutely want to use this data and make sure the council's aware of the study. And so we can figure out a way to bring it to the council that you can see the results of it. And so let us think a little bit about how we do that. But I agree. I think, and we've already talked to other departments, like making sure that everyone knows about this data that's out there so that it can really inform other policies and other departments as well.
Exactly. Yeah, maybe it's an informational report. And CSC obviously is also a body that would, I think some of their decisions would be also influenced by the data. Okay. Good. Mark, anything on future agenda items? No. Okay.
No.
Okay. Great. Then staff announcements or task force member announcements or referrals?
Just if I can get the link sent ahead of time, like our normal council meetings, just because it's traveling and moving and things like that. It's a little complicated sometimes for me.
Yes, the panelist link. We'll make sure you get that, and then we'll try to remember. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, you're asking for the slides, right, Aisha?
I'd love the slides as normal, right? Beautiful too. But whatever I can get ahead. I think Director Ott, Assistant City Manager Ott and I had a text exchange earlier when I was having trouble.
Yeah.
Got it.
Like try to make sure that doesn't happen again.
No worries.
Yeah, that did come out like 5 o'clock or 5:30 or something like that.
Yeah, right before the meeting. But if it's on the calendar, I've been having some things that we've talked about. So
yeah, okay. We'll figure out a way to make it work for you.
Perfect.
Got it. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. Anything else for the good of the order? With that, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Great work.
Thank you so much.